Kendall, from the point of view of Canada's oil sands producers, what's their take on the energy transition?
Yeah, great question, Markham. I think the way we're looking at it is hydrocarbons are an incredible source of energy and incredibly valuable and needed. We just have to figure out how to deliver that energy in a non-emitting way. The issue here isn't about stopping using oil and gas, it's about stopping the unabated combustion of oil and gas that creates greenhouse gas emissions. And we are well engaged now in that technological transition to be able to do that. So, whereas traditionally you would have, used oil and gas for, whether transportation or heating or whatever purpose and burning it, now we're learning and need to transition rapidly to delivering those fuels in non-emitting ways. So that could be hydrogen, that could be biofuels. And the production also is where we're really focused as oil sands producers right now, is on the immediate need to decarbonize the production of oil sands. We're responsible for about 12% of Canada's emissions, and decarbonizing the production of those products is an incredibly important part of Canada achieving its national ambitions.
Unabated emissions. Now, I can see where and we agree on the need to decarbonize production. So that's about 20% of all the emissions that come from oil and gas.
Yeah.
The other 80% comes from combustion. And I could see where on a natural gas power plant where you could abate that. You could put CCUS
Sure.
on that
Yeah.
and get most of those emissions.
Yeah.
But the oil sand sells into the refinery market. You're making transportation fuels, either diesel, aviation fuels, sometimes gasoline. Those are almost impossible to abate. So what do you do with Scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, so that, is obviously something we're seized with, right? And you're absolutely right in terms of that's where the majority of the emissions occur. So again, that can look like delivering the energy in different forms. Hydrogen is a good example. So, heavy transportation, aviation, there may be a line of sight to electrifying those, but it's not near term. Right now, the mass balance just doesn't really work for that mode of transportation. And so you're trying to get that diesel and aviation fuel out of the market. So, we can run heavy haulers on hydrogen. And that's originally derived from oil and gas, but it's a non-emitting form when it's combusted. Sustainable aviation fuels, is something we also have a long ways to go on, but it gives us line of sight to delivering fuels to those markets that don't create combustion emissions with the end user. That's really the end game.
But that doesn't address the issue of bitumen and ultra-heavy sour crude that the oil sands produces, unless you figured out some way to turn bitumen into hydrogen.
Good, yes, in that when we talk about blue hydrogen, it's a natural gas-based process, right? We are piloting technologies to convert bitumen to hydrogen in reservoir and working on that. That's not commercial yet, but it's certainly something we're working on. The other thing about our heavy oil product is a lot of that already and will continue to grow. The markets are non-combustion already, so you look at asphalts. Heavy oil is increasingly being sought after as a petrochemical feedstock, particularly in Asia. Natural gas has become prohibitively expensive. So, and a growing carbon fiber market is a really big potential for us too. So, even the most aggressive IEA decline scenario for oil demand is still showing about 25 million barrels a day in 2050, a good chunk of which are heavy barrels, and that's quite a different market, as you fully appreciate, from light oil. And so a lot of those heavy oil demands are going to be there indefinitely. And again, for the combustion end uses, we're continue to work on those to delivering the energy in different forms. So it's 30 years from now. That's a lot of time, and we'll see how the technology plays out. But we're very much seized with the notion of kind of cradle to grave decarbonization of hydrocarbons. we think the world would be hard pressed to replace the energy content of hydrocarbons through other forms in any kind of a reasonable time frame. So the fastest way to reduce emissions is to acknowledge that hydrocarbons will be used for some period of time and decarbonize those aggressively, parallel path with developing non-hydrocarbon alternatives.
Well, I'm very interested about your comments regarding post-combustion uses for bitumen. So carbon fiber and asphalt and basically advanced materials.
Yeah.
And Alberta Innovates is already working on that, has been for a number of years. And Energy Media is on record like 3 years ago arguing that there ought to be, that industry ought to be supported and de-risked and expanded so that it rises as a domestic market for bitumen while, eventually the refinery market, the fuels market, begins to decline over time. So one comes down and the other one increases, and you could foresee a scenario in which the oil sands actually has a future beyond 2100.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
We've argued that. I don't see pathways, I don't see the oil sands companies arguing that very aggressively. It's like a little tiny footnote in the conversation. And even yesterday, the Premier Danielle Smith was saying, on Monday at our press conference, that really is, part of the future for Alberta. When does that become a bigger part of your conversation?
Yeah, that's such a good point. We made a decision, rightly or wrongly, to downplay that initially because, admittedly, those are relatively small markets today. And so we didn't want it to appear that we were, not focused on the core challenge of our base operations. We have to decarbonize those. But I don't disagree. We need to be talking more about the U part of CCUS, right? We only talk CCS, but the utilization part is extremely important, both economically and in terms of actually putting that stuff to productive end use. And, I heard a really interesting stat from Alberta Innovates. I mean, we're obviously not the only heavy emitting industry that has decarbonization challenges. Steel, cement, petrochemicals, fertilizer, you name it, right? This is a broad problem. Steel, for example, has, at least in oil sands, we have a technological path to net zero. There are some sectors that actually right now don't even have the tools in the toolkit to get there. They can and will do a significant chunk, but they're waiting for a technological breakthrough because in steel, for example, they're really struggling to come up with ways to generate the heat they need to for their process in any other way than current technology. So displacing steel with carbon fiber, for example, is a really important thing globally. Carbon fiber is, can be done in a non-emitting way and is lighter and stronger, and there's all kinds of good reasons that you would expect that carbon fiber market to grow. If you took all the asphaltenes coming out of the oil sands in today's current production and converted it to carbon fiber, it would displace 1% of the global steel market. So it's potentially huge. And so I take your point and agree 100%. We probably need to be talking more about that because I think it's a valid question when somebody says, why would you invest in decarbonizing oil if oil is going away? The reality is oil is not going away for all these reasons we just discussed. And so I think we probably should be talking more about those non-combustion uses.
So let's talk about carbon capture, utilization, and storage for a moment. I interviewed Mark Cameron, and I think Alex Pourbet and other CEOs are on record saying this. The cost to decarbonize the oil sands by 2050 will be $75 billion. The government has been looking the producers have been looking for $50 billion from governments. Whether or not that's a good investment, I think it depends in part on whether you see a long-term future for the oil sands. I mean, you could also foresee a scenario in which you build $50 billion worth of CCUS and a decade later the companies fail because demand has decreased. I know the companies have modeled out to 2050, modeled their competitiveness in a declining demand market. What do you say, though, that hasn't been shared publicly? I don't think it's even been shared with the federal government, from what Minister Wilkinson tells me. What do you say to Canadians who say, I'm a little worried about investing my tax dollars in CCUS because it could be a stranded asset? What do you say to them?
Yeah. I mean, one of the first important things to frame that conversation is when you talk about government support for these kind of projects, remember we pay on the order of $50 billion a year in royalties and taxes to governments. So we're actually only asking for a small portion of that back to support decarbonization and the transition of the sector. So we don't even really think about it as, direct government or taxpayer investment. It's actually just government taking slightly less economic rent from the industry to allow us to use those funds to reinvest in decarbonization. In terms of why would you make this investment? Again, even the most aggressive scenarios out there, a 1.5 degree scenario, still shows on the order of 25 million barrels a day in demand in 2050. If we made these investments now, there'd be more than enough time to monetize that in value add many times over between now and 2050, even in that most aggressive decline scenario. The other thing that's really important is, why would any country do this, right? Because these projects don't make money in and of themselves. So Europe is advancing CCS aggressively, for example. When you look at those big hubs in the UK and Norway, they also know there's a whole bunch of hard-to-abate heavy emitters in Western Europe who need access to CO2 storage, because CCS is really the only tool in the toolkit in the near term to mitigate those emissions. So for them, it's a business opportunity. They're going to bring in CO2 from all those other countries and inject it in their offshore CCS projects and make a business out of it. So Canada has very much the same opportunity, right? We can make a business out of this. It'll look different in that we won't be bringing CO2 emissions in from elsewhere, but you'll have other industry pop up around this CCS infrastructure. Even in Alberta right now, there's a couple of really big petchem expansions that are kind of on the verge of FID. They're only considering being here or expanding here because of access to CCS. For the last decade, we've been losing those projects to other jurisdictions that are lower cost. But they also have their own net zero plans and needs, and so they want to locate their business where they can access CCS. If you want to do direct air capture, that CO2 has to go somewhere. We talked about hydrogen, blue ammonia. Those are incredibly important fuels of the future. They need CCS. And so when you build this CCS infrastructure, you'll get a whole bunch of spin-off industrial development associated with that. I mean, we're here at the World Petroleum Congress right now, and I know the Alberta contingent has been getting hounded all week by the Asians who want to understand what CCS looks like here, and can they come here and can they access green hydrogen from here, or blue hydrogen from here, and blue ammonia? Can they set up direct air capture operations here? So that's the exciting part, where you make the investment, and then not only do you future-proof and preserve your core industries to continue to be the important parts of the economy that they are, but you're going to create a whole bunch of additional economic activity.
I agree that there will be business opportunities attached to the CCUS that the Pathways Alliance is planning. But under your current plan, you're calling for the termination in Cold Lake, which is a very remote, small community. There's not much industry there. Why wouldn't, if you want to have spin-off benefits, indirect benefits from the CCUS infrastructure, why wouldn't you terminate it in some place like Fort Saskatchewan, where you've got, which is an industrial hub?
Well, there are, of course, hubs that have been awarded in that area and are proceeding on that premise of kind of, being centrally located for the multitude of emission sources there. We chose our location because, capturing and storing our own emissions from our oil sands operations was our primary objective. But when I talk about, the opportunity, it's not just our project. It's that broad CCS network that would include the heartland area that you're referring to. Yeah.
Okay. What about, I want to get back to this, the modeling, because you've mentioned a couple times that under the IEA's net zero scenario, 2050 we'd see 25 million barrels a day of oil demand. But the Saudis can produce, a barrel of oil for $10. There are plenty of other low cost producers who can certainly do it for $10 to $15. Norway is $15 a barrel. Right now, the average in the oil sands is between 30 and 40, and some of them are over $40 WTI break even. So, given if the oil sands are going to be one of the last oil producers standing, are they able to get their costs down low enough so that they are competitive in 2050? What does the modeling say?
So again, there's an important distinction between light and heavy oil there. A lot of those really low-cost basins you refer to are light oil basins. We're not really competing with them. In a heavy oil context, we're more competing with Venezuela and Mexico and some Middle East. Oil sands also have, from a pure operating cost perspective, are quite competitive. The net cost of greenfield development oil sands is high, and in a declining demand, declining price scenario, you might not see a lot of new growth in the oil sands. But we think that our existing base that we've been fortunate enough to build up over the last couple of decades, you've got this mostly fully amortized, fully depreciated asset base producing about 3.5 million barrels a day. Our operating and sustaining capital costs, when we look at other heavy oil sources around the world, are very, very competitive. And we do think we can compete on both cost and carbon in that declining scenario.
I've heard former Cenovus CEO Alex Pourbaix talk about how the it's not an energy transition, it's an energy diversification. And I asked at Premier Smith's presser on Monday, I said, okay, that seems to be the consensus at the World Petroleum Congress, but I haven't heard an evidence-based argument in favor of that. All I've heard is criticism of the IEA for making the claim that, calling peak oil demand by 2030, and you can build a pretty good evidence-based argument around China driving an electrification of transportation argument for peak oil demand by 2030. So what happens if you're wrong? What happens if Saudi Aramco and ExxonMobil, who have made this argument here, are wrong? What's the plan B to make sure that the oil sands is competitive and isn't stuck with stranded assets that not only cost shareholders, but also cost governments and taxpayers?
Yeah, I think the question is, what reasonable timeline could that kind of shift occur in? You're right. The folks around here would generally think that IEA 1.5 degree scenario is extremely aggressive. And to your point, maybe it's not, but I also can't see it possibly being more rapid than that. That is the best case scenario. And again, it still results in a 25 million barrel a day demand in 2050 that we think we can compete for. And so I guess my answer is, even if things go as rapidly as possible, we still have 3 decades to make this investment and for it to pay off in terms of 3 decades of continued economic rent from our resources for the good of all Canadians.
I want to wrap up our interview, Kendall, with a bit of a conversation about sustainability and biodiversity. There's been a lot of criticism about the oil sands because of the 37 tailings ponds and greenhouse gas emissions, and particularly the indigenous communities downstream of the oil sands plants have raised the alarm. Most recently over the Imperial Oil's Curl plant leak and spill. It seems like, from the reporting that we've done, that the industry talks a good game, but there still are lots of problems around spills, leakage, impact, chronic toxicity in the Athabasca River, chronic toxicity in the surrounding ecosystem. Does the industry have a plan to address that going forward?
Yeah, so I guess my first response would be, we have a world-class monitoring program in place for the oil sands for all of those air, land, water, biophysical parameters you mentioned. And for the last 10 years, we've been spending $50 million a year collectively doing the absolute best regional and cumulative effects monitoring that I'm aware of that occurs anywhere in the world. And we've done a terrible job of communicating those results. It's been virtually non-existent. And so, I think it's easy to understand why there's those concerns in the communities when we haven't really shown them the results of all that work. And so we're working closely right now with governments and other stakeholders to get that data out and spend time in those communities, help them understand. We actually think the story is a really, really good story. And when you look at the relative health of the ecosystem across those key parameters in northeastern Alberta, it's actually really, really good. And again, we've just collectively failed to communicate that in a proper and in some cases non-scientific way that's accessible for the residents of those communities. And we are committed to doing a much more robust job of that going forward. And we're absolutely committed to addressing all those aspects of our business and communicating it better.
Well, here's an example. In April, when the House of Commons Environmental Committee had a number of the Imperial Oil and the Alberta Energy Regulator and Indigenous leaders and so on, they testified before the committee. And Rich Kruger, the Imperial Oil CEO, said very clearly, we have released the data around that spill and around the leak. And it's on our website. So I went to the website and to look for it, and the company did not release data, it released a video about the data. And I had a scientist, Dr. Lauren Fitch, review that, and he said, this isn't enough information for a scientist to make any credible determination or have an informed opinion about the impact on the ecosystem based on the data that's provided in that video. I mean, this is only a few months ago.
Yeah.
So what kind of better communication of data are you talking about? The kind that Imperial Oil provided, which is just an overview in a 20-minute video, or are you talking about real transparency, releasing the data so that independent scientists can review it and comment on it?
The latter, absolutely. And that data is there. We have it, and like I said, it's been collected for the last 10 years. I think Imperial has openly acknowledged that their communication on their event was very sub their own standards. That is not how things should have happened, and I think a lot of work is happening right now to ensure that doesn't happen again in the future. And then in broader in the whole industry scheme, we are absolutely committed to what you're talking about, and I couldn't agree more. We need the experts in the room with all the data to make eyes wide open, informed decisions and assessments, and then to govern our business accordingly and make sure we're operating in a way that does not create any sustained and long-term environmental issues that can't be mitigated and managed and reclaimed over time as we put these operations back to original state as our operations do wind up. There's nothing more important to us than ensuring that we've got line of sight to that full life cycle of the asset, and that we're working particularly with Indigenous communities to involve them in that process, make sure their concerns are understood, and ultimately to develop and remediate and reclaim the resource in partnership with those communities.
Well, Kendall, thank you very much for this.
My pleasure. Thanks, Markham. Take care.